Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence, with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm Steve Francisco. Our guest today is a return visitor, a familiar face to many of you who may have seen him not only on this program, but frequently on WCCO and local TV stations here in the Twin Cities, as well as commentary that he provides that appears in national publications like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, other places. Professor David Schultz of Hamline University and my alma mater, the University of Minnesota Law School, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
It's my pleasure, and thank you to the audience.
Let's jump right into it. We have just come off the results of a midterm election which seemed to be full of surprises. The much predicted red wave turned out to be more of a red ripple, if you could even call it that. There were predictions that the Democrats would lose anywhere. I heard predictions from 20 to as much as 40 or 50 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. History suggested that that might happen too, because usually the president's party in a midterm election tends to lose seats in that midterm.
26 historically in the House, 4 in the Senate. You're correct.
Right. So that didn't happen this time. And Republicans are beside themselves with the results of this election. Why do you think this happened?
Well, there's a lot of good reasons for it. You know, some people are going to say that you're right. It was supposed to be a red wave. It got blunted by the Supreme Court's decision overturning Roe versus Wade.
This summer.
But I'm going to make it even more fundamental. At the end of the day, you have to have what? Good candidates, a good message, a good strategy. And I'm going to say at the end of the day, why the Republicans did so badly? They have a bad message. And part of the bad message was what? Here is a party that worked for 50 years to try to overturn Roe versus Wade. What's that old expression? Don't ask for something, you might actually get it. They got what they wanted, and they suddenly realized that, guess what? We are a pro-choice nation. We are a country that actually supports certain types of rights. And what I think wound up happening here is that political posturing to the base came into conflict with the reality. They also nominated across the country, and we'll talk about this, people like Dr. Oz and people like that, Herschel Walker, Kerry Lake, they're just bad candidates.
Well, and Herschel Walker's race remains to be settled, of course, in December, a December 6th runoff with Senator Raphael Warnock down in Georgia. But what factor, if any, do you think the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol also played in this election?
Well, I think one of the things that pollsters miss, and we're going to talk more about polling later, when pollsters were doing surveys, and about 70% of the American public said we're going in the wrong direction. Pollsters are thinking economy, crime.
Right.
What they're not thinking about is something else more fundamental, the state of American democracy. They're thinking about the fact, I think the public was thinking, that we can't have another January 6th. And so I think in part, along with abortion, along with Donald Trump de facto being on the ballot, it was democracy on trial in America. And I think voters turned out not in record numbers, and we'll talk about that too if we want, but they turned out because this was an issue and people were afraid. People were afraid that if this election went wrong, what's the future of American democracy?
Right. And this seemed to translate down the ballot at both the federal level and the state level. Here in the 2nd Congressional District, a very fiercely fought battle between incumbent Congresswoman Angie Craig and Tyler Kistner, who made his second run against her, and he came up short again. But also in the state races, we saw Governor Tim Walz, all the top constitutional officers reelected, Attorney General Keith Ellison, who looked like he was headed to defeat, was reelected, and the legislature unified party control under the Democrats for the first time in many years, that they won both the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate. So it seems like some of these national trends and concerns translated directly into the state election results as well.
They do. It speaks to the polarization in American politics right now, where people seem to be voting Democrat all the way down from governor or president down to dog catcher, and the same on the Republican side. And that polarization played in. What's important to think about also in this election is even though it wasn't a red wave, it also really wasn't completely a Republican wave or a Democrat wave.
Right.
It was more kind of a mixed election. I think it was an election that basically reinforced the status quo. And what I mean by that, only one U.S. Senate seat flipped, very few incumbents lost, and at the end of the day, I think voters said, we want stability. We want stability in our democracy. We want stability in our country. And in many ways, we have to be thinking about that. We also have to be thinking about, and no, Democrats won by the fact that the Republicans didn't have a red wave. But pierce beneath the numbers here, a caution for the Democrats. 5 million more people voted for Republican congressional candidates than Democrat. Republican senatorial candidates got 500,000 more votes than Democratic senatorial. And in Minnesota, at the Senate level, 3 Senate races decided for Democrats by basically 2,000 votes.
Wow. State Senate races.
State Senate races. So we're looking at what I describe it as is that this was an incremental shift, a battle for the suburbs, a battle to win over, let us say, the Egans, the Lakevilles of the world.
I'm glad you brought that up because I've said to several people I've talked to about the election results, you're confirming it. This place we live in here in the South Metro Egan, typical of suburban areas, not only in Minnesota, but around the country, where the independent voters in those suburban communities weighed issues other than the economy, as we were talking about. They weighed this issue about protecting democracy and looking for stability. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree. I think Dakota County has become just about one of the best swing counties in Minnesota, kind of the classic bellwether, and a great example of really sort of looking at counties across the United States. And the way I describe Dakota County right now, take a municipal boundary line between Burnsville and Lakeville. That's the political Mason-Dixon line in this county right now. And the battle, I'm going to say, for control of Minnesota is Dakota County and Washington County. And if you look at the results, where the major fights occurred, where a lot of the money was spent, where the flips occurred, Dakota, Washington County. Yeah.
It was very interesting to see, even in some of the state legislative races, state Senate races, where candidates ran TV ads in the metro. And you're thinking, well, by far, most of the people watching this TV program, they're not even going to be constituents who live in the district of that candidate. But some of the races were so close that they felt like it was worth the investment to even buy advertising for a state Senate race.
You're right. Right. And if we and in going into this election, of the 134 House seats, the 67 Senate, by best estimates, 9 House seats were in play, 7 Senate seats. So the control for the legislature is down to a small handful. And what that meant for the non-competitive races, hardly any money by comparison. And those small handful of ones, that's where the money went. And one of the advantages that the Democrats had was that they had a lot of money and they were able to spend it. Now, if you're happy about progressive candidates, you say this was good. But still, at the end of the day, one of the other stories of this election $18 billion estimate in terms of how much money was spent, more than any midterm, perhaps more than any presidential election cycle in history. Heck, to put this in comparison, the amount of money was spent would only get you half of the price of Twitter for Elon Musk at this point. But what I'm getting at here, the good part was progressive candidates or Democrats won. The bad part was, what? This is the result of Citizens United,
right,
or the amount of money can be thrown into what? Senate races that are state Senate races that are millions of dollars.
And David, tell our viewers just really quickly what Citizens United was again, what you're referring to.
Sure. Citizens United was a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2010 that said that corporations have a First Amendment right to spend money, including out of their corporate treasuries, to affect federal and state races. They still can't, corporations, give directly to candidates, but they can spend money on behalf of candidates.
And they did.
They did. And we could look at, since 2010, the amount of money that's happened in terms of spending in federal races and state races has gone up, and the amount of money that corporations are spending has just exploded.
So this is going to be a recurring issue in our politics, where you have corporations and wealthy individuals like an Elon Musk throwing around billions of dollars toward particular candidates,
right,
or causes. And the only way we're going to be able to undo it is a constitutional amendment?
Constitutional amendment, or as Justice Brennan used to say to his law clerks at the beginning of every year, everything is about 5. When you get 5 Supreme Court justices who say that, guess what? We think Citizens United was incorrectly decided. We are going to overturn that. That's important to keep in mind, because this is a Supreme Court under Roberts that seems to like to shoot down precedents. And if I can pardon the pun there, they're creating a precedent to overdo precedent. Well, at a future Supreme Court might very well say that what? Money is not speech.
Right.
Money is money. Right. And that we need to
place... And corporations are corporations, not people.
Exactly. Yeah. And they should not have the same rights,
right,
as breathing human beings.
Your comments lead me into our next line of questioning, which we have witnessed beginning with the Dobbs decision, which throughout 50 years, half a century of established judicial precedent saying that women have a right to reproductive freedom. They have the right within the trimester structure of Roe versus Wade to determine whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. Right. And the Supreme Court threw that out. Now, it's interesting to me that one of the arguments of many of the so-called pro-life proponents was, well, this issue is best left to the states. But what you're actually seeing now in the Congress are members of Congress, Lindsey Graham being one of them, who have said, no, we need national legislation to ban abortion.
Yeah.
So much for the idea of leaving it to states.
You're absolutely correct that the hypocrisy there is written in capital H at this point. But let's go back to the election. What's really fascinating about the 2022 election, across the country, in every situation where there was legislation on the ballot to restrict abortion rights, it lost. Every single place at this point. Now, what's going to happen? And let's speculate a little bit here. We're going to see a lot of states now start to enact some codification of Roe or protect abortion rights, because we are basically not just a pro-choice state in Minnesota, but American public opinion, depending on how you define it, we are basically a pro-reproductive rights country. But let's think about something interesting at the state level now. The Democrats have the trifecta. There's been talk about saying, well, they're going to codify Roe in legislation. Now, it's going to still be difficult to get some of those suburban conservative districts that Minnesotans won over to go along with it. But how about a different idea? We don't codify Roe. We make it as a constitutional amendment.
You anticipated my next question, David. We're thinking along the same lines.
Yes, we are.
This is great, because I was going to ask you, is there a chance that we will see a DFL legislature prepare legislation presenting to the voters of Minnesota an amendment to the Constitution to protect the right to choice?
I think it would be a a very smart move.
Because right now, the decision, as I understand it, there was a case in the Minnesota Supreme Court, the Gomez case,
Correct.
which basically said the Minnesota Constitution affords women this protection. But if the composition of our Supreme Court change or the person in the governor's office change, that could all go right out the window. Whereas it wouldn't if you had the state constitution amended to protect that right.
Correct. And also, think of it from a strategic point of view and learn from a mistake the Republicans made. Was it 10 years ago? I think it was 2012. The Republicans thought they had a great idea. They said, let's put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to declare that marriage is only between opposite sex, man and a woman.
And the voters said?
No. And the Republicans thought it would be a way to motivate their base.
Right.
Well, it motivated, but
it also motivated the other side.
That's right. And so think about it now, a constitutional amendment to basically protect reproductive rights, put it on the ballot. Would this motivate people to vote? It would. Would it motivate Democrats? Yes, absolutely. Because if this election is any indication of what happened, you could put that on a ballot as a constitutional amendment. It potentially could be an enormous boon for Democrats.
Very interesting. I'd like to talk to you too about some of the implications of the Dobbs case going beyond abortion, because many legal commentators, and perhaps you've commented about this yourself, are concerned that the implications of the Dobbs decision extend far beyond the issue of abortion or terminating a pregnancy to issues such as marriage equality, to decisions about contraception, even to the issue of interracial marriage.
Correct.
And so, you know, I know some conservative commentators are saying, no, that's not where we're going to go with this. Well, if you had asked 10 people 5 years ago, did you think that Roe versus Wade was going to be overturned? They would have said no. What's your read on that? Are these other rights at stake involving contraception and involving perhaps family planning and marriage equality?
Perhaps if you read Clarence Thomas's opinion in Dobbs, where even though Justice Alito, in writing the majority, said, oh, no, we're not talking about these other issues about marriage equality, contraception, and Thomas was blunt and said, well, I think we should rethink all these issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I wouldn't take anything off the table with a 6-3 conservative majority at this point. I think you have to worry about all of them. And I'm not a paranoid person whatsoever, but I think the fact that you've got Thomas saying this, and the fact that he is no longer the fringe on the Supreme Court as he was 30 years ago, in some ways I would argue it's Clarence Thomas's court now. He's right in the center.
That John Roberts, the Chief Justice, has basically lost control of the conservative bloc.
That's right, that's right.
Yeah.
And so now we're looking at not just conservative bloc, but like really ultra-conservative. And one of the things that Thomas also fails to understand, I'm a law professor. In American law, it's the constitutional text plus judicial precedent that makes the law. He always wants to go back to the original text, and it's like, wait a minute, if one of my students made your argument, I would fail them because
they would not pass.
They would not pass because you have to look at text plus precedent. The way I describe American constitutional law, it's like a chain novel. The framers wrote the first draft of the novel. Subsequent American history and court opinions have written the subsequent chapters. And Thomas wants to take all the subsequent chapters, rip them out, and go back to a constitution written essentially by a bunch of old white men who were slaveholders who didn't believe that women or people of color had rights.
Yeah, which would exclude millions and millions of American voters if we went back to that idea.
Including Clarence Thomas.
Including Justice Thomas. As long as we're on the subject of Justice Thomas, I want to ask you another question, David, about him. There's been a considerable amount of controversy, as we all know, the events of January 6th, the election deniers, the people who led the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, and they're what I would call the people who aided and abetted this offense against our democracy. Turns out one of those people happened to be the wife of Justice Thomas, Ginny Thomas. There have been some people who have said that it is inappropriate for Justice Thomas to be deciding any cases involving challenges to the election or cases that touch on that, because there is a conflict of interest there with his wife being involved. I saw an interview where Mrs. Thomas said, "Oh, my husband and I don't talk about his work and my work." A little bit hard to believe,
Correct.
but she said it. Isn't one of the canons of judicial ethics that for judges and lawyers that you not only have to abide by the law, you have to avoid the appearance of impropriety, which means that in certain cases you need to recuse yourself because of other factors, right?
You're absolutely right. I teach professional responsibility in law school, which is legal ethics for people who haven't gone to law school. And one of the things I talk a lot about, and right now I'm in the middle of talking about conflict of interest, and I say to my students, not only do you have to worry about the real conflicts of interest checks, like representing two opposing parties,
Right.
but the courts are going to say to you, you have a higher duty as basically a representative in a democracy, as an officer of the court, to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest. And so think about the double obligation that Thomas has. First, he has an obligation, as everybody should have in government, to avoid appearance of conflict of interest, because to the public, appearance is reality. And two, as a lawyer and as a justice, the way that the court maintains legitimacy is by people believing that it's not biased. There's no question that he should recuse himself. And in many states across the country, canons of judicial ethics, if he were on, let's say, a state Supreme Court somewhere, he would be required to recuse himself.
But being on the U.S. Supreme Court, my understanding is that each individual justice makes their own decision as to whether or not they should recuse themselves. They may get the Chief Justice to say, hey, I hope you'll consider recusing yourself, but isn't it ultimately up to each individual justice at the federal level on the U.S. Supreme Court?
That's right. You're absolutely correct. And so Thomas has to answer to nobody but himself at this point. And granted, we always want to be concerned about not attributing things from our spouse to ourselves.
Right.
But most state laws in terms of conflicts of interest, if I can go beyond it, when they talk about, let's say, financial benefits and so forth, they identify immediate family members. And here, when you basically have your wife who is contacted and has been recorded as sending emails to Wisconsin and Arizona election officials saying, basically, don't certify the election, trying to encourage the false electors to get seated. There seems to be a problem if he hears any election law cases, because it's the appearance of impropriety.
Goes right to it. The Supreme Court, after the Dobbs decision this summer, their approval rating has taken a hit. All of the opinion polls we've seen, and I think what we were saying earlier is that this seems to have been reflected in some of the election turnout and election results.
Correct.
That approval of the court's legitimacy depends upon public approval, that we accept their decisions as legitimate.
Correct.
Even though we may not always agree with them. There are various calls for reform. Some people have said we should change the rules and abolish lifetime tenure. There ought to be an age limit. Some have said maybe we ought to increase the size of the court. What is your reaction to some of these reform proposals? And isn't there a danger that some of them could even backfire and not bring us to the results and not give us the kind of court that we want?
No, you're absolutely correct. I think there is something that needs to be reformed, but I'm not sure if it's necessarily institutional. What I mean by that, like constitutional amendments. Part of it is about what used to be called the passive virtues of the court. The idea that the court doesn't hear certain types of cases, that the court doesn't overreach. There's a sense in which, again, almost going back to a sense of judicial professionalism, to say that yes, I could do this, but I shouldn't. And that's the part that I think needs to be reformed. We have 6 conservatives who are emboldened, who somehow now think they are legislators wearing robes. And somewhere along the line there, almost seems like someone needs to explain to them this concept of what? Separation of powers. The idea that policy making is made by electorally accountable policy makers, presidents in Congress, and not made by the judges.
Of course, what's ironic in that is that that's the argument that conservatives traditionally made against liberal justices.
Of course it is.
Back to the days of the Earl Warren Court.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We never saw, though, the Warren Court deciding presidential elections,
Right.
and we never saw
And
the
taking away constitutional rights.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We're running low on time, David. I don't want to let you get out of here today without asking you about a very provocative and well-written article that you did that was published in the Star Tribune in October. You wrote an article, you noted that the ACT test, the test scores used by colleges and universities to assess candidates for admission, began falling in 2016 pre-pandemic.
Right.
There's been this big narrative we've heard that, oh, test scores collapsed during the pandemic. Actually, you see that they were falling before that. But you stated in that article, tests such as the ACT are part of a self-perpetuating cycle of elitism that stratifies American education along racial and class divisions. Say a little bit more about that, and I'm particularly interested, do you think colleges and universities, that it's time for them to set aside standardized tests? And what criteria would they use in assessing candidates for admission?
Well, first, I would get rid of all the standardized tests. What's winding up happening at this point, and I talked about this in my piece, is that part of the problem also with K through 12, we teach to the test. We're not teaching students the broader analytical et al. Skills. But we have pretty good evidence that the ACT, SAT, I'll even throw in things like LSATs, for law school like that.
Law school admission
Law
tests,
school like that they are, we see powerful correlations between class and race. We know these are exams that are at least partially coachable. What do you mean by that? If you're wealthy enough to hire a coach, to hire a tutor, you can improve their scores. And so what winds up happening is that students who do well get into colleges that have high ACT scores, and it self-perpetuates the cycle of elitism. I would get rid of it. Now, are grades pretty good predictors? Not bad. But we need to be also thinking about the other forces that are out there that are driving our educational disparities in our country. And Minnesota, unfortunately, is one of those states with absolutely horrendous racial disparities.
Yep.
So there is no silver bullet. There is no kind of cross that you nail into somebody's heart, or whatever, wooden stake, I guess, or was it like vampires, whatever.
Right.
But certainly getting rid of the ACT, SAT standardized tests is one step in the right direction.
Very interesting. There's certainly a lot more we could talk about, and we're just not going to have time to do it today, so we definitely have to have you back on.
Excellent.
To talk further about the affirmative action case that the U.S. Supreme Court has heard, where affirmative action may be on the chopping block next. And also further discussion about what kind of reforms can we do in education that eliminate the disparities that we're talking about and really benefit all of us as a community. So we'll have to revisit that subject on a future occasion. Professor David Schultz of Hamline University and the University of Minnesota Law School, thank you for being with us today. As always, thank you for your insights on all of these and many other issues, and we'll see you again soon.
Good. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.